Welcome. In this lecture, we will talk about dissolved oxygen, biological oxygen demand, and chemical oxygen demand. We'll understand the differences between all of those. Now, as we all know, drinking water is one of the most essential and important constituents, and its quality really matters. Because if the quality of water is not good, a human being can be vulnerable to numerous waterborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, and so on. So, maintaining water quality and purity of water is really important. Now, water can be polluted by numerous activities, as we have already seen. These could be human-induced activities or anthropogenic activities. It could be because of industries, it could be because of manufacturing, discharge of the municipal waste, discharge of the hospital waste, industrial waste, and what could be the form of pollutants that are present in water. The pollutants could be detergents, pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, radionuclides. Organic pollutants could be there, inorganic pollutants, sometimes chemical carcinogens can be there, or sediments or metal pieces can be there. So the variety of pollutant in the water can range in a numerous way, and therefore when we talk about treatment of water, we follow a three process treatment, which is primary, secondary, and tertiary form of treatment, right? So we'll come to that as we proceed further in this lecture. First of all, let's understand what is dissolved oxygen. So what happens is, let's say we are living on the earth, right? We are not inside the water, but on the within the atmosphere, what we require is oxygen. But what would fishes do? What would the organisms that are living in the water do? They would require oxygen, but what kind of oxygen? The oxygen which is actually dissolved in the water. And the oxygen which is dissolved in the water is what is called as dissolved oxygen. As simple as that. So this is the first thing that we understand, that dissolved oxygen is required for all aquatic life to survive, and this amount of dissolved oxygen in the water is a measure of the purity of the water. If the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water body is less, that means the oxygen is depleted, and since the oxygen is depleted, it would be detrimental to the aquatic organisms, ultimately causing mass bleaching, we could say, or removal of the organism. So what does dissolved oxygen depend on? It depends primarily on two things. One is the temperature of the water, and the other is the salinity of the water, right? Now, what would happen? The solubility of dissolved oxygen would increase if the temperature is less. That means I can say cold water holds more dissolved oxygen as compared to hot water. So hot water has less dissolved oxygen, and as a result, I take a very simple example. At the site where you have the industrial discharge moving into the water, what would happen? The temperature would increase. What happens there? If you remember, we talked about thermal pollution. So thermal pollution is the pollution because of the industrial discharge. That region actually has a relatively higher temperature. So it's not just the higher temperature that is maintained in the region which is the cause of the death of the organisms in the region, but because the water is hot, what would happen? It would have lesser dissolved oxygen, ultimately depleting the aquatic life in that area. The other important thing that we need to understand is fresh water versus saline water. So fresh water has higher amount of dissolved oxygen as compared to saline water, which has less amount of dissolved oxygen. Another very important aspect. Now, dissolved oxygen is always understood as percentage saturation, or milligrams per liter is the unit under which we study dissolved oxygen. What are the major sources of oxygen? Oxygen, as we know, is generated through photosynthesis by the green plants or some bacteria, and the oxygen that we breathe is actually produced by the green plants. Now 75% of the total oxygen that we receive, you would wonder, comes from where? It comes from phytoplanktons. Now these phytoplanktons are present in the ocean surface. 75% of that total oxygen that we breathe comes from phytoplanktons. That means oceans themselves are a very important source of oxygen generation. What if the oxygen is depleted within the ocean layers as well, or within the water layers as well? So if oxygen consumption, I can simply put it as, if consumption is more than production, what would happen? The dissolved oxygen would reduce. If the production is more than consumption, then the amount of dissolved oxygen would increase. That's a very simple statistics that we can understand. It's simply as the income and expenditure. Let's say I earn 5,000 and I spend 7,000, I would go into debt. And the same happens here. If I'm consuming more of oxygen as compared to what is being produced, the amount of dissolved oxygen would obviously be less. If the production of oxygen is higher than the consumption, then there would be higher amount of dissolved oxygen that would be present, as simple as that, right? Now, again, important thing that we need to understand is this dissolved oxygen is not always constant. The amount of dissolved oxygen fluctuates. It fluctuates with seasons, it fluctuates with temperature, it fluctuates with freshwater, saline water, it fluctuates with numerous other parameters. So wherever there are hot water discharges, such as a water used for cool machinery in a manufacturing plant, this increases the temperature of water, as I said, the reason for thermal pollution, and ultimately reduces the amount of oxygen content. Now, this oxygen which is present, the oxygen atom from O2 is reduced to 0 oxidation state to -2 oxidation state in H2O or OH negative hydroxyl radical. So this is how this actually happens. Now, if I go into the detail, what would happen into acidic versus a basic solution, right? In both the processes, there would be a half redox reaction that would take place. So what would happen in an acidic case? In an acidic case, oxygen would react with hydrogen ions and 4 electrons, let's say, but it would create 2 water molecules. However, in a basic, it would react with water molecules along with free electrons and lead to formation of hydroxyl ions. Now, what is the basic idea? The solubility is simply the change of oxygen from a gaseous state, we can say, to an aqueous state, and this governs the solubility. So this is true as per the Henry's law, right? So solubility is one of the most important things. So concentration of dissolved oxygen is actually small, and the solubility is determined by the Henry's principle, as we have seen. Now there are few other methods that we need to understand. Also, if we talk about dissolved oxygen, there are anaerobic and aerobic processes. So what would happen in an anaerobic process and aerobic process, we would come as we proceed further, but just to introduce, anaerobic process is one which happens without oxygen. However, aerobic process is one which happens with or in the presence of oxygen. Now, to understand and find out the dissolved oxygen, right, there are few methods. Winkler method is one such method. So what happens is, the sample for which the dissolved oxygen has to be measured, that water sample is added with the magnesium salt, right? Now this magnesium salt is added and the solution is made strongly alkaline. Now once the solution turns alkaline, that is pH more than 7, we can say, this oxidizes to produce MnO2. Now this MnO2 can be reacted with potassium iodide in a medium which liberates the iodine. So iodine which is liberated is titrated with a hyposolution. This hyposolution is Na2S2O3. This is also known as sodium thiosulfate. Now with this iodine is titrated with the hyposolution, or what is also known as the sodium thiosulfate or sodium